The first thing I realized wasn't that I was in danger, but that the silence of the woods had become far too heavy for a summer night. I sat frozen in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin nylon wall of my tent as a faint, rhythmic scratching sound vibrated through the earth beneath my head. It was the sound of something metallic being dragged very slowly across a rock just inches from where I slept. I didn't breathe, I didn't move, and I certainly didn't reach for my flashlight, because I knew that the moment I signaled my awareness, the game would change from observation to confrontation. I had hiked 12 miles into the backcountry of the North Cascades to find peace, away from the noise of the city and the constant pinging of my phone. The spot I chose was a small, flat plateau overlooking a valley that felt like the edge of the world. During the day, it was a paradise of green pine and gray granite, but as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, the shadows grew long and predatory. I had set up my camp with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before, never once thinking that I was being watched from the treeline. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a flicker of light that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the warm, dancing glow of a dying campfire or the soft white light of the moon. It was a sharp, piercing blue LED light, the kind you see on high-end tactical gear. It swept across the top of my tent once, twice, and then vanished. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I lay there in the suffocating darkness, straining my ears to catch the sound of footsteps. Why would someone be out here at this hour without a heavy pack or the sound of shifting gear? Why were they standing perfectly still just outside the perimeter of my camp? I began to wonder if I had accidentally stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see, like a hidden stash or an illegal poaching route. The intrigue of the situation was quickly replaced by a cold, primal fear as I heard a low, muffled whisper coming from the left side of my tent. "Is he awake?" A voice muttered, so quiet it was almost lost to the wind. There was no response, only the sound of a heavy boot crunching down on a dry branch. They weren't trying to be silent anymore, which was the most terrifying realization of all. It meant they didn't care if I heard them, or perhaps they wanted me to know they were there to see how I would react. I reached out slowly, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold steel of my bare mace, the only defense I had against whatever was circling me in the dark. I kept asking myself why they hadn't just walked up and asked for help if they were lost hikers. The blue light flickered again, this time illuminating the silhouette of a tall figure standing near my cooking stove. I could see the outline of a man wearing a heavy jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't looking for food. He was looking at the entrance of my tent, holding something long and thin in his right hand. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke me as I realized my only exit was through the front zipper, which was currently being guarded by a stranger who had no business being in the middle of the wilderness at 3 a.m. I had to make a choice. Stay trapped in this nylon coffin and wait for them to make the first move, or create an opening and run for the steep trail I had climbed earlier that day. I heard the sound of the zipper teeth beginning to strain. Someone was testing the tension of the fabric, looking for the weakest point to gain entry. My mind raced through the possibilities, wondering if there were 2 of them or 3, and what their ultimate goal could be in such an isolated location. I knew that if I waited any longer, I would lose the element of surprise. I didn't think, I just acted. I gripped the canister of bare mace in one hand and my heavy hiking boot in the other. With a sudden, violent motion, I kicked the side of the tent where the silhouette was standing, hoping to disorient him for just a second. I heard a grunt of surprise and a heavy thud as the figure stumbled back into the dirt. I dived through the tent flap, not even bothering to grab my shoes or my pack. The cold mountain air hit my face like a slap, and for a split second, the blue light blinded me as it swung directly into my eyes. I didn't look back to see who was holding it. I sprayed a massive cloud of the stinging orange mist into the air behind me and sprinted toward the edge of the plateau. My feet were bare, and every rock and root felt like a knife pressing into my skin, but the adrenaline numbing my body was the only thing keeping me moving. I could hear shouting behind me now, angry, frantic voices that echoed off the canyon walls. They were following me, their heavy footsteps thumping against the earth as they tried to close the gap. I knew the trail better than they did because I had studied the map for hours before the trip. Instead of staying on the main path, I veered off into a dense thicket of mountain laurel, sliding down a steep embankment that led toward a dry creek bed. I pressed my back against the cold stone of a boulder and held my breath, praying that the darkness would be my shield. The blue light scanned the trees above me, cutting through the branches like a searchlight. I watched as the figures moved past my hiding spot, their breathing heavy and labored. They stayed for what felt like hours, circling the area and whispering in frustrated tones before the light finally began to recede back toward my campsite. I waited until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon before I dared to move. My feet were bleeding and my body was shaking from the onset of hypothermia, but I was alive. I didn't go back for my gear. I hiked the remaining 10 miles to the trailhead in a blur of pain and fear, finally reaching my car just as the sun broke through the clouds. When I reported the incident to the local authorities, they found my campsite completely destroyed. My tent had been shredded, and my supplies were scattered across the woods, but nothing of value had been stolen. The rangers told me that I was lucky to have run when I did, as there had been reports of a group of men using the remote trails to move stolen goods across the border. They didn't want my money. They wanted to ensure there were no witnesses to their route. I still go camping, but I never go alone, and I never stay in the same place for more than one night. Every time I see a blue light in the distance, my heart skips a beat, and I find myself reaching for the zipper of my tent, making sure I always have a way out. Because the scariest thing about the woods isn't the animals that live there, it's the people who think they own the silence. I found a second set of boot prints in the mud inside my tent, but the problem was that I hadn't even taken my shoes off yet. I stood there in the fading orange light of the sunset, staring at the wet, ribbed patterns on the floor of my nylon shelter, feeling a cold drop of sweat slide down the back of my neck. The prints were larger than mine, caked with a different shade of clay that didn't match the immediate area, meaning whoever had stepped inside my tent had traveled from the lower valley just to find me. I had spent the last 3 days hiking the Ridgeline Trail, a grueling stretch of elevation that most people avoid because of the sheer cliffs and the unpredictable weather. I loved the isolation, or at least, I thought I did until I realized that the isolation was an illusion and I was actually sharing this ridge with a ghost. I looked around the campsite, my eyes darting between the thick pine trees and the jagged rocks, but everything was deathly still. There was no wind, no birdsong, just the sound of my own shallow breathing and the distant hum of a waterfall. The first sign that something was wrong happened 2 days ago when I noticed my bear canister had been moved from where I tucked it under a log. I dismissed it as a curious animal, even though the heavy plastic bin showed no teeth marks or scratches. Then, yesterday, I found a small pile of smooth river stones stacked neatly on top of my folded rain fly while I was away fetching water. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, or perhaps another hiker being playful, but there were no other cars at the trailhead and I hadn't seen a single soul for 48 hours. As the darkness began to swallow the ridge, I felt a heavy sense of being hunted, not like a predator hunts prey for food, but like a collector watches a prize. I crawled into my tent and zipped the flap shut, the sound of the teeth clicking together feeling like the final seal on a tomb. I sat there in the dark, clutching my small camping knife, wondering why someone would follow me all this way just to step inside my tent and leave a footprint. An hour passed in total silence before I heard it, the sound of a heavy weight shifting on the gravel just outside my head. It wasn't the light, skittering step of a deer or the clumsy trudge of a bear. It was the deliberate, balanced footfall of a human being. They were standing right there, just inches away from the thin fabric that separated me from the world. I could hear the faint rustle of synthetic fabric, the kind of sound a windbreaker makes when someone is reaching for something in their pocket. "I know you saw the print," a voice whispered, the tone so flat and devoid of emotion that it made my skin crawl. I didn't answer. I pressed my back against the center pole of the tent, trying to make myself as small as possible while my heart thundered so loudly I was sure he could hear it through the walls. The intruder began to walk slowly around the perimeter of my camp, his boots crunching rhythmically on the dry needles and stone. Every few steps, he would stop and tap the side of the tent with what sounded like a fingernail. Tap. Top. Top. You have such nice gear." The voice continued, moving toward the front of the tent now. "I've been watching you struggle with that stove for 3 days. You really should be more careful with your matches. The wind-up here is dangerous." The realization hit me like a physical blow. He hadn't just found me today. He had been sitting in the shadows of the trees, watching me eat, watching me sleep, and following my every move from a distance I couldn't perceive. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I imagined him standing over me while I napped in the afternoon sun, perhaps even reaching out to touch my gear while I was unconscious. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the talking. I waited for a long time, my muscles cramping from the tension, until I heard the sound of my backpack being dragged across the dirt outside. I had left it leaning against a tree, thinking it was safe, but now I heard the clicks of the plastic buckles being undone one by one. He was going through my things, taking his time, enjoying the fact that I was trapped inside and too terrified to stop him. "I think I'll take this," he said, and I heard the unmistakable sound of my car keys jingling in the air. "You won't be needing these for a while. It's a long walk back to the city, isn't it?" The sheer audacity of the threat snapped something inside me. I knew that if I let him take my keys and disappear into the night, I would be stranded on this ridge with a madman who knew exactly where I was. I couldn't stay in the tent anymore. It was a trap, not a shelter. I grabbed my bear spray from the side pocket of my sleeping bag and took a deep, shaky breath. I didn't unzip the tent. Instead, I used my knife to slice a jagged hole through the back wall of the nylon, a move he wouldn't expect since he was focused on the front flap. I tumbled out into the cold night air, rolling onto the sharp rocks and immediately scrambling for my feet. The moon was a sliver in the sky, providing just enough light to see a tall, thin figure standing by my backpack with a wide, unnatural grin on his face. He turned toward me, his eyes widening in surprise as he realized I had escaped through the back. He dropped my keys and reached for a heavy branch on the ground, but I didn't give him the chance to close the distance. I lunged forward and unleashed a massive cloud of pepper spray, the orange mist catching the wind and hitting him square in the face. He let out a choked, gurgling scream and dropped to his knees, clawing at his eyes as the chemicals began to burn. I didn't wait to see if he would recover. I scooped up my car keys from the dirt and bolted down the trail, not toward the trailhead, but toward a steep shortcut I had seen on the topographical map earlier that day. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, my headlamp bouncing wildly against the trees as I navigated the treacherous descent in the dark. I could hear him screaming somewhere far behind me, a high-pitched, echoing sound that faded as I put more distance between us. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. Nearly 3 hours later, my clothes torn and my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock my car door. I drove straight to the nearest sheriff's station, my mind replaying the image of that second footprint in the mud over and over again. When the deputies went up to the ridge the next morning, they found my tent slashed to ribbons and a small, hand-carved wooden doll sitting on my sleeping bag. The doll was wearing a tiny piece of fabric that had been cut from my own hiking shirt while I was sleeping the night before. They never caught the man, but they found evidence that he had been living in a shallow cave just a few hundred yards from my campsite for weeks. I never go back to the high ridges anymore. Whenever I feel the urge to hike, I stay in crowded parks where there are plenty of witnesses because I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, someone is still looking at a piece of my shirt and waiting for me to come back to the woods. The emergency weather radio didn't pick up a coming storm. It picked up a recording of me talking to myself in my tent exactly 1 hour ago. I sat frozen on my camp stool, the small plastic device crackling in my palm, as the speaker emitted a tinny, distorted version of my own voice saying, "I hope the rain holds off so I can get some sleep." Those were the words I had whispered to the empty air while I was organizing my sleeping bag, and hearing them played back to me in the pitch-black woods made the hair on my arms stand straight up. I was camped in a remote basin known for its lack of cell service and its deep, echoing valleys, a place where the only sounds should have been the wind through the pines and the occasional snap of a twig. I had brought the radio specifically for safety, wanting to keep an eye on the localized mountain weather, but now it felt like a tracking device that had been hijacked by someone hiding in the darkness. I turned the dial, trying to find a clear channel, but every frequency was filled with the same low, rhythmic static, punctuated by the sounds of my own breathing from earlier that night. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for how a shortwave radio could capture and rebroadcast a private conversation from inside a nylon tent. The only possibility was that there was a high-powered microphone hidden somewhere in my camp, or worse, someone was sitting very close with a transmitter, mocking me by playing my own life back to me. I looked out into the wall of trees, my headlamp cutting a weak path through the mist, but the forest seemed to swallow the light before it could reveal anything meaningful. "Who's out there?" I called out, my voice cracking with a mixture of anger and pure, unadulterated dread. Instead of a verbal reply, the radio in my hand hissed with a sudden burst of white noise, and then a new sound emerged, the sound of my own footsteps from my hike into the basin that afternoon. I heard the distinct rhythm of my boots hitting the gravel and the heavy sigh I had let out when I finally reached the clearing. It was as if someone had been following me since the moment I stepped off the main road, documenting my journey with professional precision. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability, realizing that my every movement had been observed and recorded by an invisible audience. I began to wonder if I was part of some sick game, or if I had wandered into the territory of someone who didn't want their privacy disturbed. The curiosity was gone, replaced by a desperate need to find the source of the broadcast and put as much distance between myself and that radio as possible. I stood up and began to walk toward the edge of the clearing, holding the radio out like a dowsing rod, noticing that the static grew louder and the recording grew clearer as I approached a large, hollowed-out cedar tree. My heart was pounding against my ribs, each thud feeling like a drum in the silence of the night. I reached the tree and shone my light into the dark cavity of the trunk, expecting to find a speaker or a hidden camera, but instead, I found something much more personal. Taped to the inside of the bark was a small, black digital recorder and a series of photographs that had been taken of me over the last 4 hours. There I was setting up the tent. There I was eating a granola bar by the creek. There I was looking directly at the camera without even knowing it was there. The intruder hadn't just been watching me. They had been close enough to take high-resolution photos while I was completely oblivious. A twig snapped loudly behind me, and I spun around, the radio falling from my hand and hitting the soft earth with a dull thud. A man was standing near my tent, his face partially obscured by a dark hood, holding a pair of heavy-duty headphones around his neck. He wasn't moving, he wasn't lunging at me, and he wasn't saying a word. He was just standing there, watching my reaction with a terrifyingly calm expression. "You have a very quiet way of walking," he finally said, his voice sounding disturbingly familiar because I had just heard it on the recording. "Most people are much louder when they think they are alone. I appreciate the silence you bring to my forest." He took a step forward, and I saw the glint of a long, serrated knife tucked into a sheath on his belt. He didn't look like a hiker or a ranger. He looked like someone who had lived in these woods long enough to forget how to be human. I knew that if I stayed to argue or tried to demand an explanation, I wouldn't make it to sunrise. I didn't reach for the recorder or the photos. I just started backing away, keeping my eyes fixed on his shadowed face. He didn't chase me immediately. He simply picked up the radio I had dropped and turned the volume up until the static filled the entire clearing. He seemed to enjoy the noise, as if the electronic interference was the only music he ever heard. "Don't leave your memories behind," he called out, his voice fading as I turned and sprinted into the trees, guided only by the faint light of the moon reflecting off the creek. I didn't follow the trail this time because I knew he would expect me to go toward the car. Instead, I scrambled up a steep, rocky slope that led toward the high ridge, hoping that the difficult terrain would slow him down. I could hear the radio static echoing through the basin for a long time, a constant reminder that he was still down there, perhaps watching me climb through a pair of binoculars. I spent the rest of the night shivering under a rock overhang, my eyes wide and my ears straining for the sound of those headphones or the crackle of a transmitter. Every time the wind whistled through the rocks, I thought I heard my own voice calling out to me from the darkness below. It was the longest night of my life, a psychological torture fueled by the knowledge that I was being transformed into a file on a stranger's recorder. When the sun finally rose, I made a wide circle around the basin, avoiding my original campsite entirely. I made it back to my truck by midday, my body aching and my mind fractured by the experience. I drove directly to the park office and told them everything, showing them the location on the map. The rangers found the hollow tree and the recorder, but the man and my tent were gone, leaving behind nothing but a small pile of radio batteries arranged in a perfect circle. They told me they had received similar reports over the years of a listener who lived in the valley, someone who didn't steal or kill, but who took pleasure in the terror of his subjects. I never went back to that basin, and I never turned on a weather radio again, because I'm always afraid that if I find the right frequency, I'll hear the sound of my own heart beating in the dark.